We acknowledge, celebrate and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present and future of cybernetics. Design and cybernetics fried with historical notes. Today we're in conversation with Matthew Holt. We've asked Matthew 4 questions. Let's see what he says.
Okay, we are good to go. So yes, thank you, Amy. I've just joined the 3A Institute at the School of Cybernetics. So my background, and it's very exciting, my background is in design. And so here's an example, I think, of some of my design work. So I would call myself an historian of design. But that doesn't mean I have not also done some practical work. And so what you're seeing here is a project I did in Sri Lanka. And then I was more or less the head designer of that project and was setting up a college for the University of Technology, Sydney in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And what those plants are, as you can see, are kind of copper. Very, very beautiful things that an architect and I worked on. It's slightly cybernetic in the sense that you can adjust them, you can move them. They are quite flexible. And I can tell you from experience, the whole process of building and designing is an incredibly cybernetic experience, just on the very basic point of the amount of feedback you get through working through a building, engaging with buildings, engaging with spaces. You can see here, it's a typical kind of architect's photograph, no people in it, but they are in fact spaces to be used. So that was a college. On the other side is covers. So I did a lot of book design. I was a head designer for a publishing company for about 10 years. And that itself is another feedback, dealing with authors and lots of variabilities there. And so that's some of my design. So I've been asked a number of questions, as all the guests are, so I'll attempt to answer them for you today. Again, thank you for your patience. And so the first question is my personal history with cybernetics. Okay. So it actually goes back quite a distance, quite a long time. So this is a slide in which is representative of the kind of material and the kind of authors and the kind of readings I was doing at university, Generation X, and this is what we called theory. So theory was effectively the group of French philosophy or philosophers that we read, and when I say we, so our generation, and very, very closely and very engaged with. From clockwise from the top here is, of course, Michel Foucault, very famous for his skivvy wearing, Hélène Cixous, Gilles Deleuze, Julia Kristeva, Jacques Derrida, and Lucie Irigaray. So they had a common theme. These are French philosophers, really effectively from the 60s and 70s. They had a common theme, and that was the displacement, if you like, of the human subject as the center of knowledge. That is, as both the knower and the object of knowledge. Now, this didn't mean these philosophers didn't think people were important. What they meant was that our systems of knowledge had been constructed on, fundamental differences established between, say, subject and object, between mind and body, very much male and female, self and other, and also between human and world, or human and non-human, between what was rational and what was irrational, and so on. But for these philosophers, these distinctions were not only artificial, but formed a kind of defense, if you like, of a particular dynamic of culture and history, and needed to be pulled apart. So you probably have heard of the term deconstruction, and that's associated with Jacques Derrida, and that's exactly what that kind of pulling apart was. Theory then was a critique of patriarchy. It was a critique of logocentrism, which means the primacy of reason and rationality. It was a critique of ethnocentrism, of the domination of Western thought, and finally of the hierarchy of man, in inverted commas, above animals, artifacts, and nature. So these are very heady times, I can tell you. And I remember when I first read Derrida, my brain practically exploded, and haven't been the same since, for good or for bad. Now, if man, again in inverted commas, is to be displaced as the center of thought and experience, and of history too, then what comes instead, or what comes after? Well, a certain independence, if you like, or autonomy of language, a certain independence of systems, a kind of an equality or equivalence between human, machine, and animal. And perhaps, I think above all, a new emphasis on the idea of environment. A little bit different from ecology, that was a part of it, but the idea of environment. So in other words, we could say a cybernetic epistemology. So the question became, if we are truly only embedded in systems, okay, again, language itself was a great example of this period, then what happens to concepts such as agency, choice, self-determination, autonomy, and so on? And for us, for this generation that we were thinking through these problems, that in itself was kind of the cybernetic problematic, if you like. The working out of agency, given that we're always already, and that was a kind of very common phrase, always already embedded in systems. So that was my first encounter. So the second, a little bit more personal. Here we are in New York. My second encounter was about 10 years ago. I was in New York City delivering a paper to a combined audience from the Parsons Design School and the School of Visual Arts, actually on a French philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, and his work on the themes of design and environment. And so, in fact, in 1972, he actually gave a paper at the Museum of Modern Art on a symposium establishing a University of Design. And at that symposium were a number of system thinkers and cyberneticians. Anyway, so a colleague invited me to a launch of a documentary on one of the evenings I was there on design thinking. And at the launch, I met someone and we got talking about the paper I was giving, and he invited me over to his apartment the following day to have some chat and some famous New York pastries. And the fellow name ended up being Paul Pangaro. And so I went to his apartment, and if you have a look, that slim building in front of the Chrysler there, I'm pretty sure that was his apartments. So his apartment was full of original volumes of the Macy conferences. He had a grand piano there. I think he wrote music theatre. And a view, as I just said, straight to the Chrysler building, favorite building in New York. So close you could almost reach out and touch it. And I really didn't know who he was at the time, so it was a bit funny. But I know he's also going to be a guest on this as well. So that should be interesting. However, from that meeting, I really began, especially historically in terms of history, trying to discover the connections between design, but also design thinking and cybernetics. And so in doing so, I discovered that all roads didn't lead to Rome as such, but they led, at least initially, to the German city of Ulm. So we have here, the first thing is the cover of, I want to show you is the cover of the Cybernetics Volume 1, 1985. Paul Pangaro was the associate editor of this, and the issue contained an introduction by Paul Pangaro on the work of Gordon Pask. And it's, so that's the cover there. It's a great cover. It's got wonderful illustrations if you can get your hand on it. Okay, and so the next city we look at is all roads led to not Rome. And so this is the city of Ulm in Germany. And what this is this next slides, thank you. And after the war, this is, okay, so this question is cybernetics past, so I'll sort of move straight to that. So it's question 2. So what's your favorite tool, approach, or story from cybernetics past, and why? And this is the school it's called the Hochschule für Gestaltung Ulm. And it was established after the Second World War in the 1950s by the Scholl Foundation. The Scholl Foundation was dedicated to Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were young resistors of the Nazi regime and were murdered by the Nazis, and their surviving sister and her husband, graphic designer Otto Eicher, set up this school through their foundation after the war. And it was intended to be a new Bauhaus, which is perhaps the most famous design school of all. And the Hochschule für Gestaltung was dedicated to producing kind of rational, enlightened, democratic education for a new era. So initially, its learning methodology and curriculum followed the Bauhaus and its learning by doing method, and its emphasis on the art training for designers. But this soon changed, and quite radically. The training was considered by many at Ulm to no longer be relevant to what they understood as contemporary technical civilization. So by that term, the faculty of the Ulm School included both traditional industry, of course, but also the new information technologies, and especially computing, which is just emerging as a field of activity, but also of thought, and also the mass media. So the pedagogical model they established for design is now called the Ulm model, and it gave equal weight to theory and practice. There was also a very cool school, and this is why everything's in black and white, because they did everything in black and white. There was a really wonderful quote by someone who was there at the beginning of the school, who said that all the students wore clothes of simple and straight cut, preferably in black or grey. Color was thought of frivolous. And if you were a painter, you had to stop painting. That was unbecoming for a functionalist. And music was only acceptable if it had mathematical clarity of J.S. Bach or the syncopated lucidity of the modern jazz quartet. Okay, slight exaggeration, nonetheless. Okay, so given what I just said, given the fact that they were working in these new fields of communications, and computing, as well as traditional industrial design. A lot of the projects were there. For instance, here's electronic computer design for Olivetti by the Italian Torre Sozzas and students of Ulm. They worked in these amazing workshops where they combined students, staff, and industry all work together. Here's the next one, which is a kind of very famous Ulm design. This one, it's obviously a record player. It was designed by Hans Kugelow and Dieter Rams. Now, Dieter Rams, of course, worked for Braun, and was heavily influential on all Apple design. You can't have Apple without Dieter Rams, and you can't have Dieter Rams if you don't have Ulm School. This was actually nicknamed the Snow White's coffin. And so, you can see why. But anyway, so the next slide I have is another example of some of the wonderful work they did there. In the background, this is Otto Eicher's work. He's a graphic designer. In the background is the pictograms for the Munich Olympics, which he designed in 1972. The Munich Olympics, of course, is known probably more for the terrorist attack there, but his graphics for that exhibition, for that event, has now become standard. And in the front is a tray. It's a service tray, and he redesigned all the graphics the delivery, the interiors for Lufthansa Airlines. And this, in fact, is one of the trays, the food trays that he also designed. You can see that kind of all mosaic in there. The only thing that's kind of a bit odd is the torn, ragged edge of the bread. But this is so they're working in all these different fields. They also were working with, again, to go back to computing. This is Thomas Maldonado's work. He's one of the rectors of the school. He's developing here symbolic language for computing systems. He also redesigned in the 60s the Italian department store, the kind of Myers or David Jones of Italy, La Rinascente. He designed the services, he designed the management practices, the graphic identity, and so on. So you can see the kind of scope and scale of design at this level. They also were probably the most famously, this design school, it only lasted from 1953 to 1968, and perhaps in the later session we can talk about the reasons for that. However, the one thing they were also very well known for was turning, if you like, design into a kind of science. That was very controversial. But here's some of the work. This is from Bruce Archer. Now, Bruce Archer would then go on to be a very significant figure in the development of design methods, design management. And he also worked very closely with cyberneticians, the Gordon Pass, Stafford Beer, and Ross Ashby, in fact. The first column is a kind of feasibility study. There's a kind of, then a preliminary design, I think, and then a detailed one. And those dotted lines or compose the iteration of feedback loops. There's a lot of this kind of diagramming going on, and it continued to do so in the design methods for a long time. So, also, feedback. Yes, feedback. Cybernetics. There's Norbert Wiener, of course. You probably know that face by now. Sorry about the presentation's full of crusty old white guys, but I guess I'm one of them as well. But anyway, so the original director of Ulm School, Max Bill, is a Swiss architect and designer, studied at the Bauhaus, invited Wiener very early in the day, it was only 2 years since its establishment, to come and give some classes there, and that's him. You also see in this presentation a lot of chalkboards. So I can let you read the quote. Oh, well, I can read the quote very quickly. Is the goal of the Hochschule für Gestaltung to achieve unity. We follow with great interest the development of cybernetics. As a science of information and communication, cybernetics is also one of the foundations of the information department of our school. So that was one of the major kind of areas of study at the school. So Cybernetics ran through the whole of the organization and the college. And I'll give you an example right now. So this is some very quite significant figures at Ulm in terms of cybernetics. Again, I think this way we'll go anti-clockwise. Up again, hopefully you'll see the preference for, or predilection for chalkboards. Elisabeth Volta up there, who taught cybernetics, semiotics, and information theory in that information department. There was also journalism and media, by the way, in the information department. There was also a film school called Filmgestaltung, film design, which was the origin of the new German cinema. So Alexander Kluger was in that school. I hope you're getting a sense of how important the school was. And then we have Abraham Moles, and he is a French cybernetician, social psychologist and engineer. He, at Ulm, he applied cybernetics to product design, and some fascinating kind of examples of that, and articles he wrote about it, how to do that. So we can also talk about that. Now, continuing on, there's Max Benzer. Max Benzer was a cybernetician, philosopher, and also a concrete poet. Well, him and Elisabeth Volta ran the magazine Red, which published this material. And as you may know, had a big part in inspiring the idea of cybernetic serendipity, what we're reconstituting to a certain degree at the end of the year in November. So Spencer had actually previously organised a computer arts exhibition in Stuttgart, and that's why he was in contact with Yesha Reichardt about that, post that. So then you have Horst Rittel, and he is of Wicked's Problems fame. So I'm sure you've heard of Wicked Problems. He kind of invents the term when he moves to UC Berkeley. And I've left out Klaus Krippendorf, who was his student, because there was probably enough blokes in this. Nonetheless, the picture behind Horst Rittel is Sophie Scholl. It's one of the Scholls. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes. So I'm going to move along, even though we did start a bit late, didn't we? Okay, so there's the transnational influence of Ulm is immense. And you'll have to understand, I think, the pathways, if you like, well, Cybernetics follows the pathways of that transnational influence. They had directly assisted in setting up schools and organizations in France, Latin America, Japan, India. I found out in Bandung, in the Institute of Technology there, that a member from architecture went to Ulm. And it's impacted environmental design, so-called design thinking, all sorts of things. But in this case, this famous image now, or famous project, is the CyberSyn project. As you know, with Stafford Beer in Chile, with the government of Salvador Allende. And the head designer of the project was Guy Bonsiep, and he was from the Ulm School of Design. Okay. So, from Ulm in Germany to Canberra, probably similar sized cities, actually, now thinking about it. My next question, Cybernetics present. Now, just quickly slip through that slide to there. Thank you. So Cybernetics present, can you give us an example where you applied Cybernetics, seen Cybernetics applied? Okay. So I'm going to provide an historical example. I hope I'm allowed, given myself I call myself an historian. But the example here is the relevance and profound connection with Australia and the ANU itself. And in this case, the socio-technical, cybernetically informed, if you like, systems theory of Fred Emery. And this is still design. This time is socio-technical systems design. And so Emery was an Australian. He worked in the 50s and 60s at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. And he developed there and applied socio-technical systems theory, which basically means systems that are in which people are, if you like, impacted by and are negotiating transformational technologies. That's the important thing. At the time, it was the automation of labor, and particularly intellectual labor, in the workplace by the introduction of computing. So one of the big projects he worked on, next slide, thanks, is the project in Norway was at Tavistock, redesigning effectively the Norwegian workplace to test new organizational forms, the impacts on that of employer participation at all different levels of the company. And among the findings, which is taken up by policy, it was taken up by industry, trade unions were involved, employer associations, was that the effectiveness of semi-autonomous work groups is something, of course, we now take for granted, but was very much engendered, if you like, by Emery and his colleagues' work in this. So how workplaces and organizations can be planned or designed for the future. Okay, so and you can see from the quote there that the Cybernetics informs systems theory and very much second order in terms of open systems theory. And then again, we can talk about that a bit later in the next session. So he returns to Australia in 1969, works at the ANU, and him and his partner, Marilyn Emily, do this amazing set of projects called Search Conferences, again, based on open systems theory, and quite literally hundreds and hundreds of them. Very influential. They redesigned Gungahlin suburb in 1973, or Maryland did. That was not one of Fred's projects. And at a national level, they ran national industrial relations summits in the 70s, national manufacturing policy work for Qantas, the future of nursing. They created a new maximum security prison in Western Australia. And they went into the prison system, had the prisoners talking there with them. And apparently, according to Marilyn, one of the prisoners escaped during that period. So, and telecommunications 2000, as it was called, policies for the Department of Environment, and so on, all based in cybernetically informed open systems theory. Marilyn also conducted a lot of workshops for years with the Torres Strait communities as well. Okay, so the futures we are in, that's the title of one of Emery's book. Question 4, cybernetics future. So I've got a little bit of time. So in this one, I would like to, this is one thing you would remove or do differently in shaping a cybernetics for the 21st century. Okay, so I think we can start with a premise that our systems are now and are very likely to be in the long-term future, cyber-physical systems. So therefore, I think cybernetics is not a theory among others. It is a form of knowledge. Hopefully this has been running through the presentation, appropriate to these systems and to the form of knowledge required to guide them, steer them, and govern them, in fact. So I see kind of 3 principles or rudders within this, which I'll pose in the form of questions. Firstly, how do we construct and apply cybernetic knowledge to decolonize the discourses that constitute our society and allow the diversity of membership and participation in all those cyber-physical systems, especially the ones we've traditionally been excluded from and have been engineered in some cases for that purpose. So that leads us to the second point. How do we construct and apply cybernetic knowledge to improve and advance the democratic process of our society? This is very much why I was interested in the Emerys and in the ULM as well. This is related to participation, but to be honest, there is participation and there's participation. Just because you're participating in something doesn't mean you're as good. Therefore, I would interpret or encourage the interpretation of participation to be democratic participation. So in that sense, cybernetic knowledge is the advancement of democratic participatory practice in what is now cyber-physical systems. Okay, I'll go on to talk about what I mean by democracy, but I might not have quite enough room. So one more point and the final quote. And thirdly, improve the well-being of the people and the devices that make up the collective membership of a society. So here I'm encouraging the question that devices themselves have a life, and what I'm calling designed objects do, or design, and so we can't really talk about socio-technical systems if that proposition is not omitted. So I'll just refer you to Gilbert Simondon on this point, the French philosopher and cybernetician. Next slide, thanks. And we won't read this quote right now, but it's there in the presentation notes later. And I would like to just make one final point, one final slide on what I actually think is cybernetics. So given what I've just said, given the kind of field I'm interested in, the history, the design, and cybernetics within that, my definition of cybernetics is rigorously from Gregory Bateson or Batesonian, if that's a word, that cybernetics is the study and transformation of organized systems and their properties, where we understand that organization is in a transitive sense, not a substantive sense. So organizing and organized in that sense, organizing systems. And cybernetics should be, and some of this is based on quote, a contribution to change, but not just a change in attitude, but an understanding of that attitude. And Bateson expresses it this way. Cybernetics is not just a new or better understanding of the rules of the game, the rules of the organization, for example, but a way to change the rules themselves. He calls that agency, and we go back to that question, a human outlook, a means of changing our philosophy of control. And that kind of last comment, I think, is absolutely essential. So thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. And I will see you all soon, and also see the HDR students soon. Thank you very much.
Want more? Check out the snack pack in the video description for bonus content and resources.